On January 26, 1700, at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, a fault off the coast of what is now the Pacific Northwest ruptured along its entire 600-mile length in less than 5 minutes. The shaking lasted between 3 and 5 minutes, which does not sound like much until you understand that most destructive earthquakes last between 10 and 30 seconds. The earthquake that struck on that January night released energy equivalent to the detonation of 32,000 nuclear weapons. It dropped the coastline of what is now Oregon and Washington by up to 2 meters almost instantaneously. Within minutes, tsunamis 15 to 30 meters high were washing over coastal villages. The waves crossed the Pacific Ocean and arrived in Japan roughly 8 hours later, where they were recorded in historical documents that Japanese researchers would later use to help date the event precisely. The last time the Cascadia Subduction Zone ruptured, it shook the ground for so long that trees died standing up, their roots drowned in land that had suddenly dropped below sea level. Those ghost forests are still there on the Oregon coast today. Scientists use the rings of the dead trees to calculate exactly when the land fell. And what the trees tell us, what the sediment layers confirm, and what 326 years of accumulated tectonic strain makes scientifically certain is that the next rupture is not a matter of probability. It is a matter of when. And the when, according to every credible scientific source examining this fault in 2026, could be any day now. Geologically speaking, we are already in the window. In June 2026, 3 moderate earthquakes rattled the west coast near the Cascadia Subduction Zone. None were on the subduction zone itself. None triggered tsunami warnings. None caused significant damage. The largest, a magnitude 5.7, struck approximately 100 miles off the coast of Oregon and was associated with the Blanco Fracture Zone, a separate fault system. But the events renewed a scientific conversation that never fully stops in the Pacific Northwest, because any seismic activity near Cascadia is a reminder that one of the most dangerous geological structures in the Northern Hemisphere is constantly in motion just offshore of Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, and that the 600-mile fault responsible for the 1700 event has not moved in any major way since that night. It has been storing energy for 326 years. GPS measurements show the fault is currently locked, accumulating approximately 40 millimeters of elastic strain per year. Over 326 years, that adds up to roughly 13 meters of stored strain. That energy has to go somewhere. It always does. And the geological record shows it has always gone in the same direction, downward, in the form of a magnitude 9 or greater earthquake that shakes the ground for 3 to 5 minutes and sends tsunamis across the Pacific within minutes of stopping. This is not a theoretical risk. This is a documented, measured, physically certain event whose only unknown variable is timing. And the science published in 2026 has made that picture significantly more alarming than it was even 5 years ago, for 2 reasons that deserve to be understood clearly. The first is the discovery of a potential connection between the Cascadia Subduction Zone and the San Andreas Fault. Research published in May 2026, building on findings from a 20 to 25 deep-sea drilling expedition off Oregon, examined paired sediment layers called turbidites, created by underwater landslides triggered by earthquakes. Scientists compared the timing of turbidite deposits from the Cascadia Fault with turbidite deposits from the San Andreas Fault System, which runs through California. What they found was striking. The deposits appeared to have formed at similar times and had similar structural characteristics, suggesting that in the geological past, a rupture on the Cascadia Subduction Zone triggered a rupture on the San Andreas Fault within minutes or hours. The implication is significant enough that one of the researchers stated explicitly that if both faults were to rupture in a compressed time frame, you would have Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, and Vancouver all in an emergency situation simultaneously. That scenario would strain the disaster response capacity of the entire United States beyond anything that has ever been tested. The Columbia earthquake that killed more than 111 people this month came from a fault system that, as severe as it is orders of magnitude smaller in its rupture potential than a full Cascadia event. A magnitude 9. Cascadia rupture releases roughly 30 to 40 times more energy than the magnitude 7.4 that struck Pereira on August 10th. If the San Andreas were to follow within hours, the combined event would have no historical comparison in the modern United States. The second development that has changed the scientific picture in 2026 is the growing body of research on how little warning a Cascadia megaquake will provide. Unlike some earthquake types that produce foreshocks or detectable precursors days or weeks in advance, large subduction zone earthquakes typically arrive with almost no short-term warning. The ShakeAlert early warning system, which now covers the Pacific Northwest, can provide between 10 and 90 seconds of warning to Seattle after the earthquake begins, based not on prediction, but on detection of the initial seismic waves, which travel faster than the destructive shaking waves that follow. 90 seconds. That is the maximum window in which a person in Seattle might receive a phone alert telling them that the ground is about to shake violently. It is enough time to drop, cover, and hold on. It is not enough time to reach higher ground before a tsunami arrives. For coastal communities, the situation is more acute. The towns and cities along the Oregon and Washington coasts, from Astoria to Seaside to Newport to Cannon Beach, sit at sea level, or just above it, on land that could drop by up to 2 meters in the seconds after a full Cascadia rupture, just as it did in 1700. Educational materials from Oregon's Office of Emergency Management describe how the first tsunami waves could reach some of these low-lying coastal towns within 10 to 20 minutes of the shaking stopping. The standard guidance is that the earthquake itself is your warning. If you feel prolonged shaking near the coast, you do not wait for an official warning. You move immediately to higher ground because the official warning system may not be fast enough. The shaking is the siren. Understanding what a magnitude 9 subduction zone earthquake actually feels like requires a frame of reference that most people living in the Pacific Northwest do not have. Japan's 2011 Tohoku earthquake, which was a magnitude 9.0 and occurred on a similar subduction zone fault, produced shaking that lasted approximately 6 minutes in some locations. Videos from that event, many of which are still widely available, show what sustained ground motion of that duration does to buildings, infrastructure, and the people inside them. Structures that survived. The first 2 minutes began to fail in minutes 3, 4, and 5 as cumulative stress exceeded design tolerances. The Cascadia event of 1700 is estimated to have had a magnitude between 8.7 and 9.2. A magnitude 9.2 would release roughly 6 times more energy than the 9.0 that struck Japan in 2011. The shaking duration at that magnitude is estimated at between 4 and 5 minutes in areas near the fault. The geography of destruction in a full Cascadia rupture was mapped in detail by the Federal Emergency Management Agency in a study that has been updated periodically and remains the most comprehensive damage assessment available. FEMA estimates that a magnitude 9.0 Cascadia earthquake would kill approximately 14,000 people in Oregon and Washington alone. That figure assumes the earthquake occurs at night, when fewer people are in vulnerable commercial and industrial buildings, and when coastal populations are closer to home and thus in theory better positioned to reach high ground quickly. A daytime rupture during a weekday would be expected to produce significantly higher casualties. The same FEMA assessment estimates that the event would leave 30,000 people injured, 1 million people displaced from their homes, and cause between $30 and $40 billion in direct economic damage in Oregon and Washington alone, before accounting for California impacts if the San Andreas were also involved. One scenario in the assessment describes the disruption to infrastructure as so comprehensive that some coastal communities would be effectively cut off from outside assistance for days or weeks because the bridges, highways, and ports through which rescue and supply operations would normally flow would themselves have been destroyed. The current state of preparedness for this event in the Pacific Northwest is a subject that regional emergency management officials discuss with a combination of genuine commitment and frank acknowledgement of how much work remains. Oregon's building codes have been updated to incorporate modern seismic resistance standards, but the existing building stock, the hospitals, schools, bridges, and apartment buildings that were constructed under older codes and that still house and serve the majority of the population, has not been systematically retrofitted. A 2019 study by Oregon State University estimated that approximately 1,100 schools in Oregon were at serious risk of structural failure in a major earthquake. A follow-up assessment in 2024 found that significant progress had been made in identifying the most vulnerable structures, but that funding for actual retrofitting remained a fraction of what would be needed to address the full scope of the problem before a major earthquake occurs. Washington State has faced similar challenges. The state's Resilience Commission, established specifically to develop a comprehensive plan for Cascadia preparedness, has produced detailed assessments of infrastructure vulnerability, but has struggled to translate those assessments into funded remediation at the speed that the geological risk warrants. The ShakeAlert system represents genuine progress in early warning capability, but a system that provides 90 seconds of warning is only as effective as the public's knowledge of what to do with those 90 seconds. And surveys of Pacific Northwest residents consistently show that large portions of the population are unaware of the specific protective actions that could significantly improve their odds of surviving the initial shaking. Portland presents one of the starkest infrastructure vulnerability pictures in the region. The city sits on the Willamette River and relies on a series of major bridges for movement of people and goods. A comprehensive seismic assessment of Portland's bridges found that the majority of the older structures in the city's bridge inventory would be severely damaged or destroyed in a full Cascadia rupture. That includes bridges that serve as evacuation routes and that carry the utility lines, water pipes, gas mains, and fiber optic cables that modern urban life depends on. When those bridges fail during the earthquake, the city is divided. The east side of the river and the west side become operationally separate regions that cannot easily support each other in the immediate aftermath of the event. Emergency vehicles cannot cross. Supply convoys cannot reach affected neighborhoods. Utilities cannot be restored without repairing the crossings first. Engineers have estimated that restoring Portland's bridge inventory to full functionality after a major Cascadia event could take years, not weeks. The water system is another critical vulnerability that has received sustained attention without sufficient resolution. Portland's water supply infrastructure, which serves more than 1 million people, crosses multiple fault systems and includes aging pipelines that were not designed to survive sustained ground shaking of the magnitude and duration that Cascadia would produce. After the 2011 Japan earthquake, Tokyo, which had invested heavily in seismic water system improvements over the preceding decade, maintained functional water pressure to most of the city within days. Municipalities in the Tohoku region that had not made equivalent investments lost water service for weeks or months. The lesson is clear and documented. The investment required to apply that lesson in Portland, Seattle, and the other major Pacific Northwest cities has been estimated but not fully committed. The tsunami preparedness picture is more developed in some communities and more concerning in others. Vertical evacuation structures, reinforced buildings specifically designed to serve as tsunami refugees for coastal populations who cannot reach high ground before the waves arrive, have been built in a small number of Pacific Northwest coastal communities. Tokeland, Washington, is one of the most well-known examples, a parking garage that was reinforced and elevated to serve as a refuge for several hundred people. But the number of such structures is far below what would be needed to shelter the full coastal populations of Oregon and Washington in a full Cascadia event scenario. Building vertical evacuation structures is expensive. The coastal communities that need them most are often the smallest and least resourced, and the political and fiscal momentum to build at scale has repeatedly stalled at the point where the scope of the investment becomes clear. The comparison with Japan's approach to subduction zone preparedness is instructive and uncomfortable to make, because the gap in institutional investment is so wide. Japan has experienced major subduction zone earthquakes repeatedly over its documented history and has responded with a level of systemic investment in preparedness that has no equivalent in the Pacific Northwest. Japanese coastal communities have constructed seawalls, some of them 12 meters high, specifically designed to reduce tsunami inundation. Japanese schools conduct earthquake drills with a frequency and seriousness that makes them a meaningful part of children's physical memory of what to do when the ground starts to shake. Japanese building codes for structures in seismic zones require engineering standards that in many cases exceed those in the Pacific Northwest by a significant margin. Japanese early warning systems are integrated into mobile networks, train control systems, and factory automation, so that protective actions begin automatically, without human decision-making, the moment a significant earthquake is detected. None of these investments prevented the 2011 Tohoku earthquake from killing nearly 20,000 people and triggering the Fukushima nuclear disaster. But without those investments, the death toll would almost certainly have been dramatically higher. The seawalls slowed some of the tsunami waves enough to give more people time to reach higher ground. The early warning systems stopped bullet trains before they could derail. The building standards meant that many structures that would have collapsed under older codes stayed standing long enough for their occupants to evacuate. Preparedness does not prevent megaquakes. It changes how many people survive them. For individuals living in the Pacific Northwest right now, the scientific reality of Cascadia translates into a specific and actionable set of decisions. The most important is to understand the distinction between earthquake preparedness and tsunami preparedness because they require different responses in different circumstances. Earthquake preparedness for someone inland, in Portland or Seattle or Salem, centers on structural vulnerability of their home, on securing heavy furniture and objects that could injure them during shaking, on knowing where to shelter during the event itself, and on having supplies to function without municipal utilities for a period that, in a major Cascadia event, could extend to weeks, rather than the 72 hours that is typically recommended for smaller disasters. Tsunami preparedness for someone in a coastal community is a different and more time-critical challenge. Knowing whether they live in an inundation zone, knowing the designated evacuation routes, and most importantly, internalizing the instruction that prolonged coastal shaking is the warning to move immediately without waiting for an official alert, because the official alert system may not be faster than the water. The Oregon Office of Emergency Management publishes detailed inundation maps for every coastal community in the state, showing which areas would be flooded by a full Cascadia. Tsunami under different scenarios. These maps are publicly available online and represent the best available science about the geographic extent of tsunami risk. A significant number of people living in the inundation zones mapped by these assessments have not consulted them. A significant number of businesses operating in those zones have not incorporated them into their emergency planning. Coastal hotels, restaurants, and tourism facilities that attract visitors who have no local knowledge of the tsunami risk are in many cases not required to provide that information proactively. The gap between what is known and what has been acted on is the central challenge of Cascadia preparedness. The science is not in dispute. The fault is real, measured, and documented. The history of what it does is preserved in the earth. The consequences of a full rupture have been modeled in extraordinary detail. The investments that would reduce those consequences are known and costed. What has been lacking across multiple administrations and multiple budget cycles is the sustained political will to treat a geologically certain future event as an immediate present priority, rather than a long-term planning consideration that can always be addressed in the next budget cycle. The Columbia earthquake of August 10, 2026, which is still in its active rescue phase as this analysis is written, provides a real-time illustration of what a major subduction zone event does to a region's infrastructure and emergency response capacity. Columbia's 7.4 magnitude earthquake, centered in Chaco Department, damaged or destroyed buildings across multiple departments, disrupted transportation networks, blocked roads with landslides, triggered hospital overcrowding, cut power and water to dozens of municipalities, and required the declaration of a national emergency with more than 111 confirmed deaths. The airport terminal in Pereira partially collapsed. Communities in Chaco were unreachable for hours because every road access had been blocked by landslides or structural damage. And Columbia's earthquake, severe as it is, was on a different order of magnitude than what Cascadia would produce. The Pereira earthquake released approximately 6 petajoules of energy. A full Cascadia rupture would release approximately 1,800 petajoules. That is 300 times more energy. The ratio is not a technicality. It is a guide to the scale of difference in the destruction, the duration of the shaking, the geographic extent of the damage zone, and the challenge of mounting a coordinated rescue and recovery response when the infrastructure that makes such responses possible is itself destroyed across a region stretching from Northern California to British Columbia. That 300 times energy ratio deserves careful examination because it is easy to look at Columbia's 1 in 11 deaths and calculate a proportional Cascadia death toll as if human casualties scale linearly with seismic energy. They do not, because geography, building stock, population density, and warning system coverage all mediate the outcome. But what does scale directly and consequentially is shaking duration. The Columbia earthquake produced approximately 45 seconds of peak ground motion in the most severely affected areas near its epicenter. A full Cascadia rupture would produce 3 to 5 minutes of continuous shaking across the entire 600-mile fault zone. That is not the same event extended in time. It is a different class of engineering challenge because structures that survive 45 seconds of strong shaking can fail in the subsequent 2 or 3 minutes as cumulative fatigue and progressive damage accumulate beyond the structural threshold. Japan's 2011 earthquake documented this exactly. Buildings in areas of moderate ground motion that would have survived a 45-second event began failing in minutes 2 and 3 of sustained shaking. The duration amplifies damage in ways that standard seismic engineering tests, which typically assess peak acceleration rather than sustained energy input, do not fully capture. The paleoseismic record, the geological evidence of past Cascadia earthquakes preserved in coastal sediments, tells a story that is both reassuring in its regularity and sobering in its consistency. Scientists have identified at least 41 full-margin Cascadia ruptures, events that broke the entire 600-mile length of the fault simultaneously in the past 10,000 years. The evidence for these events appears in multiple independent lines of geological data. Layers of sand deposited by ancient tsunamis that overtopped coastal barriers are found in cores drilled from coastal marshes throughout Oregon and Washington. Sudden subsidence horizons, sharp boundaries in marsh sediment cores where salt-tolerant plants abruptly replaced fresh water. Plants, because the land dropped below sea level instantaneously, document the rapid coseismic subsidence that accompanies each full-margin rupture. Turbidite deposits on the ocean floor, submarine landslide sediments triggered by major earthquakes, are found in consistent sequences that match the timing of the onshore evidence. Each of these independent data streams points to the same events at roughly the same times with remarkable consistency. The Cascadia fault does not produce one type of evidence and hide others. Every available geological record confirms the same picture. This fault ruptures repeatedly, inevitably, and at a scale that transforms the regional landscape every time. That gives a recurrence interval of roughly 200 to 800 years for full margin events. The average is approximately 500 years. The last event was in 1700, which means 326 years have now passed. The The fault is statistically within its recurrence window for the next full margin rupture. The USGS National Seismic Hazard Model calculates a 15% probability of a magnitude 8 or greater earthquake on Cascadia in the next 50 years. That probability is not evenly distributed over the 50-year period. The longer the time since the last event, the higher the conditional probability for any given year within the remaining window. And critically, the 15% figure represents only the probability calculated within a 50-year window that runs from the present to 2076. The probability that this event will occur at some point in the next several centuries approaches certainty. The uncertainty is not weather. The uncertainty is how many years of preparation time remain before the question becomes no longer theoretical, but immediate. The research published in January 2026 added another dimension to this picture. Scientists at the University of Washington and partner institutions studying swarms of tiny earthquakes beneath Northern California have identified what they describe as a surprisingly complex earthquake zone that was previously uncharacterized. The faint tremors these swarms produce are too weak to feel at the surface, but the pattern they reveal in the subsurface points to active deformation in fault structures that connect to larger fault systems. The implication is that the geological environment surrounding Cascadia is more interconnected than the previous generation of hazard models assumed, which has direct consequences for how scientists calculate the potential geographic extent of ground shaking and secondary hazards from a full Cascadia rupture. The question that Washington State seismologist Harold Tobin has described as the hardest in his field is when and how to warn the public if scientists find evidence of elevated short-term risk. Japan's 2024 Megaquake warning, issued after a moderate earthquake, struck near a major subduction zone and held for several days before being lifted, represented the first time any government had issued such a probabilistic warning to the public. The United States has no equivalent protocol. Seismologists can detect elevated seismic activity near Cascadia. They cannot reliably translate that activity into a precise probability of imminent rupture that would justify the kind of warning that could trigger a regional evacuation of coastal communities. The mathematics of earthquake probability are deeply counterintuitive. Even in a period of elevated risk, the probability of a major earthquake on any given day remains very small, even if it is larger than it was a week earlier. Communicating that distinction to a public that tends to interpret probability in binary terms, as either a warning or a false alarm, is one of the unsolved challenges of seismic hazard communication. This communication problem is not merely academic. How populations respond to incomplete probabilistic warnings determines how many people take protective action and how many remain in vulnerable positions. Japan's 2024 Megaquake advisory was credited with spurring many coastal residents to relocate temporarily to higher ground as a precaution, reducing their exposure during the advisory period. Whether any elevated risk materialized during that window is unknowable, since no major rupture occurred. But the behavioral response, people moving out of tsunami inundation zones for a period of days based on a probabilistic advisory, was real and measurable. The fact that the United States has no protocol for issuing such advisories means that even if seismologists identified elevated precursory activity near Cascadia, the pathway from scientific assessment to public protective action is undefined. The science could be correct. The warning system infrastructure to act on it in a timely, organized way simply does not currently exist in a form that the Pacific Northwest could deploy reliably. The ShakeAlert system, which does exist and which does provide those 10 to 90 seconds of detection-based warning once the earthquake has already started, is integrated into a growing network of applications, automated systems, and public alert mechanisms. The implementation of ShakeAlert alerts in Oregon's and Washington's emergency alert systems, on smartphones and through automated systems that can shut down gas lines or slow trains before the shaking arrives, represents genuine progress toward reducing the death toll from the inevitable Cascadia event. Every second of warning translates into measurable reductions in casualties when people know what to do with that second. The challenge is ensuring that the public the system is designed to protect has internalized the response behaviors that the warning triggers. Because a phone alert that produces confusion rather than immediate protective action provides far less benefit than the same alert reaching a population that knows exactly what to do the moment the notification appears. What can be said with confidence, based on the full body of scientific evidence available in August 2026, is this: the Cascadia Subduction Zone will produce another full margin rupture. The question of when cannot be answered with precision by any scientific method currently available, but the geological, geodetic, and paleoseismic evidence all point to the same conclusion. The fault is within its historical recurrence window. It is accumulating strain at a measured and documented rate, and the energy that will be released when it ruptures next has been building since January 1700. The event will produce the largest earthquake in the continental United States in recorded history. It will generate tsunamis that reach coastal communities within minutes of the shaking stopping. It will strain the emergency response capacity of the United States in ways that will require national coordination on a scale not seen since the largest natural disasters of the 20th century. And new research suggests it may trigger a nearly simultaneous rupture of the San Andreas Fault, which would mean that every major city from Vancouver to San Francisco is in an emergency situation at the same time. The infrastructure and preparedness gaps that would determine how many people survive such an event are not abstract policy questions. They are engineering problems with known solutions, financial problems with knowable costs, and communication problems with documented best practices. The ghost forests on the Oregon coast are not just a geological curiosity. They are a record, preserved in wood and sediment for 326 years, of what happens when this particular fault lets go. The dead trees are still there. The fault is still locked. The energy is still building. The Columbia earthquake of August 10th, with its 111 confirmed deaths, its collapsed airport terminal, its damaged hospitals, and its ongoing rescue operations, arrived 7 weeks after Venezuela's twin earthquakes killed more than 6,000 people. Both events came from the same tectonic system. Both represent the physics of a planet whose interior has not stopped moving and whose energy releases have no regard for the readiness or the convenience of the civilizations sitting above the fault lines. Subduction zones do not announce their schedules. They do not wait for retrofits to be completed or evacuation plans to be finalized. They rupture when the accumulated strain exceeds the frictional resistance of the locked fault, and not 1 day later. The Cascadia Fault is locked right now. It is accumulating strain right now. The coastlines of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia are being pulled eastward by approximately 40 millimeters every year, compression stored as elastic deformation in the overriding plate. When that compression releases, the land will spring back, the coastline will drop, the water will move, and the window in which the region has to respond between the end of the shaking and the arrival of the first wave will be measured in minutes, not hours. That is the scientific reality of the Cascadia Subduction Zone as of August 17th, 2026. It has not changed since the last assessment, or the one before that, or the one before that. The fault is there. The energy is there. The history of what it does when it ruptures is preserved in the earth itself. What changes is not the hazard. What changes, or what can change, is how well the people who live above it understand what is coming, what they have done to prepare, and whether the seconds and minutes immediately following the next rupture produce the best possible outcome from a situation that no one can prevent and no one can stop. Drop your thoughts and questions in the comments. Share this with anyone you know who lives in the Pacific Northwest, in coastal Oregon or Washington, in the Bay Area, or anywhere along the western seaboard where these fault systems intersect. The ghost forests on the Oregon coast are still standing. The dead trees are still there, preserved in coastal marshes, their roots drowning since January 1700. They are the most honest statement the planet has ever made about what the Cascadia Fault does and when it does it. Because the science is not a prediction, and it is not alarmism. It is a documented, measured, physically certain statement about what this planet does, what this specific fault has done repeatedly across 10,000 years of geological record, and what it will do again. The timing is unknown. The event is not. The only remaining variable is how ready we are when the ground begins to shake and does not stop.